Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for this program this evening. My name is Tyler Liggett, and I am a member of the Dole Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Dole Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. And now please join me in welcoming our director, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Tyler, so much for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening for the fourth installment of our 2022 Presidential Lecture Series, Military Veterans in the Oval Office. This is our last installment of this virtual series, and I'm so glad that you all chose to spend some evenings with us this spring to discuss the military careers of our presidents. This evening, I'm so glad to have Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian and former Dole Institute director, with us again this evening for our final installment. You might remember the last couple of sessions we've had folks, our colleagues at the Harry Truman Presidential Library and also the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, join us for fascinating discussions about those two presidents, and we're going to pick up where they left off this evening. Richard, thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Oh, thank you, Audrey. As always, it's a pleasure.
So when we last met, Richard, it was a few weeks ago, and we discussed presidents from George Washington up through Teddy Roosevelt. It was a far-ranging discussion, and then we went in depth with our colleagues again to talk about Truman and Eisenhower. Before we launch into the legacy of World War II and beyond, our theme for this evening, do you have any comments or points you want to be sure and make about Presidents Truman and Eisenhower and their military service in the executive office?
No, I think we may touch upon them from time to time in the course of the evening. But you're right. It's really interesting. If you stop to think, I actually finally figured out there are 29 American presidents who have had some form of active military service. By my estimate, 10 or 11 of them, depending upon the exact terminology, have actually attained the rank of general. Well, you just look at the calendar. After the Civil War, we had that long, almost unbroken string of veterans, some of them generals, but all of them defined by the war experience. And then TR, who's kind of, in this as in so many other things, kind of a revolving door between the 19th and 20th century, who had what he called his crowded hour at San Juan Hill. But we don't think of him first and foremost as a military figure. And then really, you stop to think for most of the first half of the 20th century, FDR, of course, had served in a civilian capacity as Deputy Secretary, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But really, it's until you get to Harry Truman, who, of course, as your viewers know, had a distinguished role, artillery captain in World War I, and then, of course, Dwight Eisenhower, who sort of towers over mid-century. But what happened with Truman and Eisenhower is they usher in a new and very different kind of war. It seems as if almost no sooner had the peace treaty been signed on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay ending World War II, within a year we were, for all intents and purposes, locked in another, at least confrontation that Winston Churchill would memorably call the Cold War, and that's unusual in American history. Typically, there are periods of conflict, foreign or otherwise, that are followed by long periods of peace, which regrettably give way to other conflicts. But it's almost as if in the middle of the 20th century, peace treaties were signed, but there was no peace. And so that would, in many ways, not only provide the backdrop to the Truman and Eisenhower presidencies, but it turns out for the next 30 years, every president between JFK and the first George Bush came to the office with some kind of military experience. Many of them very, very active, very distinguished. Almost all of them, by the way, in the Navy, for reasons that I don't quite figure. Maybe we can talk about later on. But we begin with JFK, who of course, in part was sold to America, which after all, remember, this is only 15 years after the end of the war. The 1960 election is still regarded rather fondly, as in some ways a model election. Certainly by comparisons with more recent politics, it seems like a model of civility. And in part that was because the two candidates didn't disagree on a whole lot of things, and that in turn reflected the consensus of, you had a generation in 1960 that had lived through the Great Depression, that had lived through World War II, and that now for a decade or more by 1960 found itself waging a Cold War with the Soviet Union and to a lesser degree communist China. And so JFK came to office in many ways a fairly typical Cold Warrior, left of center, but not dramatically left of center, and a man who's, if you read the inaugural address, it's really striking how little attention he pays to domestic policy. In fact, I don't think there's a single mention of civil rights that would, of course, come in many ways to define not only his presidency but America in the 60s. It's very much a Cold War speech, eloquent, high-flown, in a lot of ways, a speech that people still remember vividly. But it was very much a speech of, in a sense, the youngest president in history, following the oldest president in history, a man who personified the military virtues. No one ever had to ask if Dwight Eisenhower, was prepared to be president or could be relied upon in the event of a Cold War crisis. John Kennedy had to prove all of that, and he began the process of proving it rhetorically in his inaugural address.
Richard, would you remind us, because President Kennedy, as one of the World War II veterans who became presidents, has one of the more dramatic moments, survival stories during his wartime experience. Can you talk a little bit more about his service and the survival aspect of that he suffered?
No, absolutely. When I use the word he was sold to America, I don't want for a moment to suggest that there was anything inauthentic about his war record, which was genuinely heroic. First of all, because he had, as we know, this kind of severe lower back chronic problem, the Army wouldn't take him. So he enlisted in the Navy, and the moment that I suppose sticks in permanent memory, I remember in the 1961 inaugural parade, pride of place was held by a float with PT 109, or a replica, obviously, of PT 109, that in many ways epitomized Kennedy's war record and the whole aura of a new, the torches being passed. I mean, 1961, there was both continuity and change. This man who in 1943, I believe I want to say September of 1943, in the Solomon Islands, in command of a PT boat, which were pretty flimsy vessels, in the middle of the night was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. And the PT boat basically disintegrated, leaving Kennedy and his crew in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a dark night in the Pacific. And by all accounts, Kennedy took charge, and he somehow got his crew onto a nearby island and demonstrated repeated instances of personal heroism and personal risk taking, to the point where PT 109 became synonymous, not only with his campaign, but in some ways with what would later be called the Greatest Generation.
I remember doing some reading in preparation for the interview, and the response for President Kennedy saying, someone asking him,
yes.
how did you become a hero? And he
Yeah.
said, they sank my boat.
He said it's easy. They sank my boat. Which again, you stop and think of JFK, you immediately think of the wit, the self-mocking wit, very unconventional for politicians, who we think of even then as kind of bloviating sorts. And Kennedy had this very cool, very cerebral attitude. One of the things that it's interesting because I know we're looking at presidents in the I won't say the narrow, but in the sense of their military experience. I would argue that in Kennedy's case, and I don't think he's unique in this regard, that military experience had a broader reach. And I give you a specific example of how I think it affects our history. In 1960, well, first of all, let's get the bad news over with first. I mean, in April of 1961, there was a disastrous military incursion called the Bay of Pigs, which is still 60 years later. It's kind of hard to imagine that people thought this was going to work, but it was basically an attempt, fostered by the CIA and anti-Castro forces in the American government, certainly under Eisenhower as well as Kennedy, to send anti-Castro, later they'd be called freedom fighters, but basically to stage an invasion of Cuba in the hope that there would be a spontaneous popular uprising. We believed our own propaganda regarding Castro and his unpopularity on the island. Well, of course, exactly the opposite happened. It was a disaster. And Kennedy, to his eternal, I think, historical credit, didn't try to evade responsibility, and was very upfront in publicly and privately. But one of the reasons all presidents make mistakes. Successful presidents learn from their mistakes. And I would argue that one of the really defining aspects of the Kennedy presidency, whether you're, for example, with foreign policy, nuclear disarmament, or at home in civil rights, JFK learned from his mistakes. In 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, the Soviet Union. Um, Again, it's amazing, 60 years later, but they thought they could get away with it. Basically, sneak offensive nuclear missiles onto Cuban soil, which meant 90 miles from American soil, um, you know, we would confront an existential threat. Um, and not surprisingly, the men around Kennedy, who by and large prided themselves on being tough, whatever that means, um, their initial reaction, the military people, but also some civilian advisors, was to basically uh, take out the missiles with airstrikes, and in any event, a show of force. And Kennedy did something remarkable. Um, he asked everyone in the room if they had read Barbara Tuchman's recently published book, The Guns of August, which tells the story of, in effect, the first month of World War I, the period when, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the great powers stumbled into this cataclysm without intending for it to happen. But and the interesting thing was Kennedy had a sense of history, and I've often thought it doesn't say anything in the Constitution about it, but along with being 35 years old and an American citizen and all that sort of thing, um, the voters at least should demand certain things of their presidents, particularly in times of international tension. And one of them, it seems to me, is a sense of history, because that in turn gives you a sense of perspective, even maybe humility, and you can learn from the mistakes of your predecessors. And that's, I think, exactly what Kennedy brought to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there were no air raids on Cuban soil. There was what he called a quarantine, what you and I would call a blockade. And it was risky. And there are those of us who were alive then who still recall vividly what it was like to go to bed at night, not knowing if you were going to wake up in the morning. But in the end, cooler heads prevailed. Khrushchev, the Russian leader, did not test the quarantine, but in fact turned around. Negotiations took place. Secret deals were cut, and they stayed secret, quite remarkably, for a number of years. And there was a sense that at the most dangerous juncture in the Cold War, this young, seemingly inexperienced, untested senator from Massachusetts really almost overnight became something of a legend. So I mean that there's I mean a life and death example of where a combination of his personal military experience and the appreciation for history that I think was inseparable from that experience came together to arguably preserve human civilization.
Well, his successor, President Johnson, wasn't quite so successful in keeping us out of a combat situation. But he, interestingly enough, when he began his military career, he was actually a congressman. Isn't that right?
That's right. LBJ, had the shortest military career, and like so many things about him, perhaps the most controversial. Within a couple of days of Pearl Harbor, LBJ, in fact, I think he was really one of the first congressmen to step forward and ask for, in effect, an extended leave of absence. He didn't resign from Congress, but he left. Obviously, made his services available to the military, and FDR, who had taken a great shine to young Congressman Johnson, delegated him in a somewhat hazy capacity to basically go off as his personal representative to the South and Southwest Pacific and look at the bottlenecks and other problems that were confronting the American military in that period when the war was really improvised as we were trying to get back on our feet after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Anyway, Johnson went. He was based in Australia and some time in New Zealand. And so anyway, one day he boarded a B-26 bomber to go on a survey, in effect, from the air and get a sense of the layout and some of the issues that he could then report back to the president. Well, he found out that there was going to be a delay in takeoff. So, he he left the plane for a bathroom break. And when he came back, he found that his seat was occupied by a friend. So he said, "Don't worry, I'll take the next flight out," which he did. Well, he discovered that day that the plane that he would have been on was, in fact, attacked and shot out of the air by the Japanese, which I'm sure did wonders for his sense of personal destiny. Even more so because the plane that he did fly was it lost electric power and had to return to the field in Australia and came under attack from a number of Japanese warplanes and it just barely managed to land safely. Well, within a matter of a day or two, Douglas MacArthur, who was the most political of generals, great general, but a very political general, um, found a way to present Congressman Johnson with a Silver Star. It was controversial then, and it's been controversial ever since, mostly because nobody else on the plane was rewarded by MacArthur or anyone else. In any event, a month later, FDR called all congressmen back to their duties on Capitol Hill. So basically, LBJ's military career, in an active sense, lasted about 6 months. The great sort of cautionary lesson, perhaps, having just told you about how important it is for presidents to be able to extract the meaning of history, of past events, in looking for parallels to guide them. It is also true that history can be misused. And I think it's safe to say that the World War II generation of presidents that we're talking about, not just LBJ, but most conspicuously LBJ, because of the rationale that were employed in Vietnam. For a whole generation, you kept hearing Munich, Munich, which was a code word for appeasement by the democracies of the West of Hitler at the time that he seized Czechoslovakia and obviously went on to wage full-scale war. Well, Munich is an important lesson, and appeasement is an important red light on the historical highway. But whether they were applicable to the rice paddies and jungles of Southeast Asia, it was debated then, and it continues to be debated.
So before we talk a bit more about Vietnam, would you tell us about Richard Nixon, President Nixon's service, and how that compares and contrasts with President Johnson?
Well, Nixon's was what you would expect: dogged, sort of unglamorous, and yet sincere. Nixon, by the early months of the war, was actually in Washington already. He was a lawyer working amid considerable frustration on his part in the government bureaucracy, and he volunteered his services very shortly after Pearl Harbor. And of course, what did the government do? They enrolled him in the Naval Aviation Program and sent him to Ottumwa, Iowa, which is not at first glance uh, the place that one would assume, um, that one would prepare for a Pacific Air War or Naval War or any war. In any event, um, he was there for several months. Um, the interesting thing about Richard Nixon, as a Quaker, he could have avoided military service altogether. But instead, he actively pursued a place in the Pacific War. He wanted to get out of Ottumwa, and he wanted to be part of where the action was. And he wound up in the Solomon Islands on Guadalcanal, among other places. He was part. He didn't take part in any frontline charges or naval actions per se, but he was part of the vast logistical army behind the scenes that was responsible for manifests and for delivery of food and other services. In other words, part of the machinery that made the army go. He spent 15 months in the South Pacific, was recognized for his service, and came back in 1946, along with a whole lot of other, newly released World War II veterans who decided to put the values they fought for in uniform to the test by running for political office. In his case, for a congressional seat in Southern California.
You mentioned, representing or the values that they fought for in World War II. In the case of Johnson and Nixon, can you tell us some stories or give us some anecdotes about how their own military service or their experience may have put them at odds with opposition to the Vietnam War and draft dodgers and resistors? Any perspectives on that?
Well, it's interesting. LBJ, again, another example of history. Remember, Johnson was just elected to the Senate in 1948, that great disputed election with Coke Stevenson, the governor of Texas, that gave rise to the sardonic name Landslide Lyndon. I think he was said to have won by 87 votes. Okay. Well, in 1949, Mao Zedong and his communist forces occupy China, chase Chiang Kai-shek to offshore Formosa, Taiwan, and there is immediately this vast post-war debate about who lost China. And I think there was a sense that the United States was locked in this almost sort of Manichean good versus evil battle with the forces of darkness that represented the international communist conspiracy. In other words, there was no perception that the Soviet Union might be one brand of communism and what was then called Red China might be another. And of course, remember, in the spring of 1950, the Korean War breaks out when some very old-fashioned, unmistakable, crossing the border aggression by the North, the communist North, against the non-communist South, brought the United States back just 5 years after the end of World War II, brought it back onto the battlefield, this time in Asia. And remember, the first war to be fought after the atomic bomb was discovered and you might say perfected. And of course, now the Soviet Union had it as well. So the point is, Johnson approached Vietnam, I think it's fair to say, with the who lost China debate ringing in his head. Johnson was, by his own acknowledgement, a political animal. He once said, I don't think about politics much, just about 24 hours a day. And I don't mean to sound cynical. The fact of the matter is that the political equation is always inevitably, critically a part of what a president has to take into consideration. But I think in this case, LBJ, first of all, you know, he's only human. I think he had a chip on his shoulder about how he became president, in the wake of John F. Kennedy's assassination. Certainly by the late 60s, he was grievously resentful of what he called the Harvards, the pointy-headed intellectuals from the Northeast who never quite accepted his legitimacy. But then on top of that, he always said, if there's ever a coup in this country, it won't come from the left, it'll come from the right. And I think he thought the loss of China, the potential loss of Korea, for example, had the Korean War gone differently than it had. I mean, he had an inescapable sense. The old line about the president is the most powerful man in the world, and I think if you probably talk to any president, whatever their party, whatever their ideology, they would agree that that's far from the truth. Certainly, Johnson, as he looked at Vietnam, felt penned in. We know now from the Johnson tapes that pretty early on, he felt that a clear-cut military victory was probably not in the cards. At the same time, there was no way that he could imagine becoming, as he put it, the first American president to lose a war. So you get into all of the man's personal insecurities, political insecurities, plus, LBJ personalized the war. It's very interesting. President Ford, when the Mayaguez incident took place, if you remember, right, a month after the fall of Saigon, American humiliation in Vietnam, some Cambodian pirates, in effect, seized an American cargo vessel, non-military vessel, in international waters called the Mayaguez. And coming as close as it did after the fall of Saigon, presented obviously both a challenge and an opportunity. But my point is, it was interesting. That was a crisis that lasted, less than a week. The interesting thing is, Ford at one point was asked, because, it's 12 hours away, so often things are happening in the middle of the night in real time as opposed to BC. Ford went out of his way to avoid the Situation Room. And there was a reason for that. His reading of history, because Lyndon Johnson had spent so much time, famously, staying up half the night, going into the Situation Room, and leaving his fingerprints on individual bombing missions, identifying targets, in effect, letting the war take over his life and his presidency. And interestingly, that was not history that Ford wanted to repeat.
So tell us a little bit about how President Ford, then Gerald Ford, how did he begin his own military service, and what was the nature of that?
Well, here's, again, the great irony. You don't think of JFK and Gerald Ford sort of in the same sentence. But the fact is, they were contemporaries who both fought in the South Pacific, in the Navy. Both had very distinguished war records. And after the war, were both in the House of Representatives. In fact, they had adjoining offices next to each other in the old House office building. They used to ride the subway over to the Capitol, where they used to joke their votes would almost always cancel each other out on domestic policy. One was a liberal, one was a conservative. But on foreign policy, and particularly anything dealing with the Cold War, they voted as as one. Um, the other thing they had in common that a lot of people don't know is that they were both very active before Pearl Harbor in an organization called America First. Now, that is a term that has come to have a lot of baggage, and in the contemporary sense, has a subtly different meaning. Gerald Ford at Yale Law School was one of a quartet of students who put out a call for a yet to be formalized organization, anti war organization, involving primarily young people called America First. And it was based upon their reading of history, particularly World War One, and the failure of Woodrow Wilson's noble sounding vision to be realized, the failure of the League of Nations, the sense that the United States, on reflection, had made a grievous error in committing 2 million of its young men. There was a sense in the 1920s that um, munitions makers had profited off of the war. You had all sorts of anti war literature, theater pieces, and the like. So by the late 1930s, there was it's easily sort of labeled isolationism, and there's no doubt there was an element of that at work. But there was a broader sense, particularly among some of the best educated and most idealistic college age Americans. Um, but it wasn't of the right or the left. Herbert Hoover supported America First, but so did Norman Thomas, the socialist leader. Walt Disney and Lillian Gish and the novelist Sinclair Lewis, and as a young Gore Vidal, future novelist. They were all equally opposed to America participating in the war, however much they might sympathize with the people, say, of London in particular, who were going through the Blitz in the fall of 1940. No one who thought they knew Gerald Ford or John F. Kennedy in 1940 would have predicted that each would become a pretty hard edge Cold War president, and someone who, in both their cases, particularly in Ford's case, really based American global security on a very strong NATO alliance, an alliance with the very continent of Europe that 35 years earlier he had really wanted to have nothing to do with it. Even while supporting America First, I discovered in the course of my research something not known until now. He tried to pull strings to get an appointment in the Naval Reserve. Ford argued that basically the way he defined America First is hemispheric defense. We're all about defending the Western Hemisphere. We're not about sending an American army to Europe to, in effect, fight European wars. And it wasn't just rhetoric in his case, because he made repeated efforts to, in fact, join the Naval Reserve. And so within a couple of days of Pearl Harbor, he had signed up for the Navy at that point, which was glad to have him. He spent a year at the University of North Carolina as part of what was called the Tunney Fish Program. Gene Tunney was nominally in charge of fitness for the Navy. And basically, the idea was to bring together star athletes, mostly football players, like Gerald Ford had been at Michigan, to train a whole generation of Navy pilots. In fact, about 19,000 went through the program just at that one campus of UNC. Well, Ford sort of was bored with, just like Richard Nixon and somewhat, he wanted to be part of the action. And again, he pulled strings and managed to get onto a ship called the Monterey, which was a kind of hybrid. It was a quasi aircraft carrier. It if you can imagine such a thing. Remember, we had lost most of our fleet, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And so, with considerable improvisation, the Navy managed to cobble together these ships that were half battleship and half aircraft carrier. And Ford would spend the rest of the war basically on the Monterey, fighting in dozens of engagements. In fact, the Monterey traveled further in his war exploits than any other ship in the Navy. But the great battle that Gerald Ford fought was in December 1944. It wasn't against the Japanese, but it was against the elements. A typhoon that nobody saw coming very nearly capsized his ship, and he was officer of the watch. It smelled smoke. The ship was on fire on top of everything else. And he went up to the flight deck, and the ship lurched in the storm. He lost his footing, slid the length of the ship, and around the lip of ships in those days was about a 2-inch piece of metal, which was designed to keep tools from going overboard. Well, in this instance, they kept Gerald Ford from going overboard. He managed to twist his body and fall down to the next deck catwalk, and he came as close to death that day as at any time, certainly during the war. The ship very nearly capsized. They lost several crewmen. He was involved in efforts to put out the fire. It was, a very distinguished career for which he was recognized. The ship limped into port. He flew back. Spent the rest of the war first in California and then in Illinois. But the important thing is what the war taught him. He had gone off an isolationist. He came back a confirmed internationalist, like his hero Arthur Vandenberg, the senator from Michigan, from Grand Rapids, who was a family friend. Basically, he, in many ways, became Vandenberg's heir. And for the rest of his life, Ford would acknowledge that he had made mistakes as a young, idealistic anti-war champion. And while he certainly remained anti-war, there's no doubt that he took his place in the chain link fence of 7 or 8 American presidents who together kept the Cold War reasonably cold, and in the end prevailed. And one, by the way, one last very important part of that story. In 1975, as president, Ford went to Helsinki to sign something called the Helsinki Accords, for which he took enormous heat at the time from left and right, as in effect acknowledging Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. But in fact, in the light of history, another reason for presidents to pay attention to these things, what we thought was the case in 1975 turned out to be very, very different. Today, the Helsinki Accords, which opened the doors on both sides of the Iron Curtain to a sustained human rights process, the Helsinki Accords are seen as a milestone on the road to what turned out to be Western victory in the Cold War.
So, less dramatic than President Ford's experience were both Carter and President Reagan to follow, but
yeah.
While they didn't see combat, they were both, their experiences were very in line with their own personal experience or their professional training.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting point that you make, because there are lots of ways for biographers to come at anyone, but particularly presidents. And typically we look at them through their legislation or their speeches or even their families. But the fact of the matter is their time in uniform, it seems to me, is it's so personal that it is really uh, and of course it's really not under their control, is it? Jimmy Carter graduated from the Naval Academy with honors in 1946. Spent 2 years in the Navy in a surface ship, and then made clear his interest in pursuing a career as a submariner. I came under the influence of future Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was considered the father of the modern nuclear navy. And Jimmy Carter, of all these presidents, was the one who was prepared to make an entire career out of the Navy. Um, but in 1953, his father, James Earl Carter Sr., unexpectedly passed away, and I think, truth be told, to the horror of Rosalind Carter, who was willing at that point in her life to put Plains, Georgia, in the rearview mirror. Um, at least the Carters have said uh, when he left the Navy to go back to Plains and take over the family business, he drove from Syracuse, New York, to Plains, Georgia. It was a long trip, and it was made all the longer because nobody spoke, which was one one way I think Roosevelt made clear uh, what she thought about this decision. Um, but anyway, Jimmy Carter was, interestingly enough, who we think of now, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and very much a man dedicated to uh, diplomatic solutions to conflicts, to negotiated solutions, election monitoring, and the like. But interestingly enough, he there was a time in his life where he envisioned himself as a maybe the next Hyman Rickover. Yeah, who knows? Ronald Reagan, interesting, had an interest in things military from the mid 1930s. Just after he moved to Iowa. Remember, he was a radio announcer and sports announcer, before he went to Hollywood, and he was taking home extension courses um, from the army, and took, I think, 14 of them. And anyway, eventually, when the war came along, bad eyesight precluded him from military service in Europe. And so, of course, by that point, he was well embarked on his film career, and he was assigned, perhaps logically, into the Army Air Force um, filming unit. They would make, best estimate is, by the end of the war, something like 400 training films, propaganda films, films that tried to explain the war, to the American people. Now, that said, Reagan narrated many of these. He appeared in some of them, but he also did at least one Army-based musical from the Hollywood studios. So he had a cinematic war, and uh, certainly went through a political, to some degree, cultural conversion in the late 1940s and early 50s. Came out of the war, kind of a liberal Democrat, someone who had voted 4 times for Franklin Roosevelt. Went through a real transformation, so that by, I think, 1952, Harry Truman was the last Democrat he voted for. And it's interesting that as the Cold War heated up, and you had people like Joe McCarthy, for example, who were making this, putting this on the national political agenda. Uh, Reagan was reading Friedrich Hayek. He was rethinking his economics, his politics generally, and of course, as we know, emerged a conservative Republican. and again, a classic Cold Warrior who turned out as a president to be the president who, along with Mikhail Gorbachev, managed the remarkable feat of eliminating one entire class of nuclear weapons, the first time since Hiroshima had been accomplished.
I'm getting a lot of questions pouring in from our virtual audience, but I have just a couple more questions for you, Richard, before we turn it over to our audience. Let's talk about President George H.W. Bush, who, of course, is the last World War II veteran we had in
That's right.
office, and the last executive that has seen combat. So talk about his
Well,
experience and his career.
and the last Cold War president too. I mean, it's really remarkable symmetry, how everything sort of came together, and it's appropriate. George H.W. Bush has, I would say, in some ways, the most impressive military record of any of the people we're talking about this evening. Um, he deferred his acceptance to Yale on his 18th birthday, enlisted in the Navy. He would become the youngest naval aviator in history at that point, through 58 combat missions. But the most dramatic, probably, day of his life came in September 1944, when he and uh, several other plane crews were involved in bombing a tiny Japanese island about 700 miles south of Tokyo, and they were shot down. And 9 of them were not recovered, and one was recovered. Bush managed to ditch his plane as far out at sea as he could get it before it blew up, and subsequently managed to um, find a floating raft. And Lord knows what the odds were against him being rescued in that place at that time. And yet, um, an American submarine did exactly that. It is said that President Bush, for the rest of his life, would periodically, I won't say felt guilt, but certainly understandably said, "Why me? Why was I saved?" And my comrades, my crewmates, met a grisly fate in Japanese captivity. Um, the interesting thing, because of course we think of Bush as the president who um, fought the first Gulf War, who also, remember, went to Panama to overthrow Manuel Noriega, which said at one point, if I ever get to call the shots, I'll think twice before sending other kids into battle. And I think he took that very seriously. And one bit of evidence of that, it seems to me, can be argued obviously either way. If you remember, um, what people thought might be a very prolonged and bloody battle to evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, which he had illegally occupied. And then, it turned out to be what the 100-hour war in terms of the actual um, uh, military thrust by this vast coalition. Obviously, American troops were at the center of it, but literally dozens of nations that Bush, exercising his diplomatic skills to the utmost, had cobbled together. And if you remember, there was criticism then from some that he didn't, quote, finish the job, that he didn't go all the way to Baghdad and remove Saddam so that he wouldn't be able to threaten his neighbors again in the future. Well, obviously, fast forward to the next President Bush and another chapter in that story. But I'm convinced that The George Bush, whose life was in many ways defined by his wartime experiences, um, was truly sensitive to the human dimension. This is not a chessboard, moving pieces around. These are the human beings that we're talking about, like those crewmates of his who, no doubt, he thought deserved to win, or to live back in September 1944, but hadn't. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I think his war experiences humanized. I mean, I think he was a pretty civilized man to begin with, but I think it gave him a special perspective. Um, in some ways, akin to what JFK had in mind when he reminded people about the lessons of Barbara Tuchman's book. In other words, an element of caution should be part of any president's modus operandi when confronting or confronted by military options.
My last question will move from talking about actual presidents who were elected to presidents who were presidential hopefuls as we look at 1996. And obviously, Senator Dole was a World War II veteran and ran unsuccessfully for the presidency. What if anything changed between 1992 and 1996, or the election of George H.W. Bush and the American consciousness? Did Senator Dole have to justify, or how did his World War II experience play out on
You
the
know, it's
campaign
it's
trail?
it's really interesting because I think, um, you know, there was and is genuine popular not only appreciation but real admiration for Dole as an authentic war hero. And I think that there were, even then, there were polls that suggested if it was, however you define character, let's say it would have been a much closer election. But in 1996, every election's unique. Every presidency is unique. The fact of the matter is, the biggest thing that you can contrast 92 and 96 was the state of the economy. People felt, now we know in retrospect, we know that the recession, in fact, had probably come to an end before 92, but people didn't feel that way. And by 96, there was a sense that Clinton was elected to be a change agent, and he had brought change. And the way that most people measured that change was in their pocketbook. And in a curious way, bordering on the cruelty of fate, there were those in 1996 who cast Bob Dole not as a great war hero, deserving of our admiration. They took the age issue, the fact that he would be, if elected, the last American president who had fought in World War II. So, in a bizarre way, in some quarters, not his service per se, but a sense that he was out of touch with contemporary culture. Now, in ironically, after 1996, whether it was the commercials he did, or the appearances he made on the Daily Show, or joking with David Letterman, I mean, you name it. Ironically, people came to see Bob Dole in a very different light, and I think a much more positive, much more contemporary light, if you will. But in 1996, I don't think he lost because of his age, and certainly he didn't lose because of his war record. I think he lost because people felt that the status quo was certainly acceptable, uh, maybe even prosperous. And it's tough to beat prosperity.
Thanks, Richard. I'll go now to some questions submitted by our audience members. This one, it says, when talking about how George H.W. Bush was the last president to see active service, you also mentioned that he was the last Cold War president. Do you think that there seeming to be less of an immediate threat, such as the Soviet Union, is why we haven't had a president with as much military experience in the last couple of decades?
That's a very shrewd question. I'm tempted to say almost it answers itself. Certainly, there has not been a sense of urgency. We've had military heroes. We've had military leaders. Interestingly enough, and it's certainly still a subject of some controversy. Both contenders in 2004, uh, uh, the second George Bush and his Democratic opponent John Kerry, saw their military records become object of debate and some of it, some very harsh criticism. Um, the We forget Wesley Clark, who was to some people seen as a perfect way for Democrats to counter the argument that Republicans make that they were soft on whatever foreign policy, and of course Colin Powell, who was probably the closest thing in modern times to an Eisenhower-like figure. But again, I would argue it wasn't Colin Powell's military service that prevented him from being nominated. The fact is, the Republican Party was moving to the right, and Colin Powell was probably the last, um, I would say, major Republican figure, at least presidential possibility, who publicly described himself as a Rockefeller Republican. Well, in 1995 and 96 and beyond, you were not, that was not going to get to a Republican presidential nomination. People admired Powell immensely for his accomplishments. They were inspired by his personal story, but ideologically, there was at no time anything, I think, approaching a majority, particularly the kinds of people who go to conventions as delegates, who would have voted for Colin Powell.
Thanks, Richard. Um, this question goes back a bit to our the beginning of our conversation, and maybe you can reflect a little bit on or elaborate maybe on some points that you might have made earlier. This is from Clarence in our virtual audience, and he said, "How did John F. Kennedy's background as a World War II veteran impact his thinking over issues like flexible response, Cuba, and Vietnam? Did it impact his foreign policy thinking at all? Any further thoughts on that?"
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think his reading of history imparted a very useful element of caution. But it's more than that. He was, well, I just said he was a Cold Warrior. But it's very interesting. Kennedy was, um, well, I'll give you a specific example. Um, General Curtis LeMay, a name that may possibly ring a bell with some people in the audience. Air Force general, kind of the classic, almost stereotype. If you think of 7 Days in May or Doctor Strangelove, the cigar chomping, bombs away, kind of caricature of a warrior. Anyway, Curtis LeMay didn't like the growing emphasis on nuclear missiles as the backbone of America's uh, defense. He wanted planes. And the fact of the matter is that science and engineers together had come up with a prototype of a plane that could fly more than twice the speed of sound. Um, but the problem with that is it's a little bit like the Concorde. Because technology is capable of producing a a leap forward, if you will. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should take the leap. It may be, as was the case with the plane called the Valkyrie, hugely expensive. It may be that, remember, Dwight Eisenhower had warned us about the military industrial complex. Well, the Valkyrie was the military industrial complex to a T. The interesting thing is, it's one of the things that Eisenhower and his youthful successor both agreed on. And they finally worked out, because Congress likes to say that it and only it can be entrusted with arming the nation. Well, Congress is often in bed with the military industrial complex for obvious reasons, and this particular aircraft was a good example. Kennedy came under real pressure from members of his own party in Congress about going ahead and building this great new innovative plane, and he pushed back, and finally was able to persuade the key figures in Congress. Look, we'll cut a deal. We'll authorize the expenditure for this new weapon system, but we won't appropriate the funds. And 2 prototypes were built, and no more. And we haven't heard about the Valkyrie since. But the technology is there, I suppose, waiting to be resuscitated. But it's a good example of how Kennedy's had a healthy skepticism, maybe is the best way to put it. His own war experiences. Gerald Ford had the same thing. When I mentioned the Mayaguez incident, and he kept getting contradictory reports of really inadequate intelligence, to be honest with you, and yet had to make decisions based upon this. And he said later on, excuse me, it reminded him of his experience on board the Monterey in World War II, where basically you had to make critical decisions with the best, often inadequate information at your command. So I would argue, in some ways, the ideal profile of presidential service in the military is obviously a commitment to the people in the military, but at the same time, a healthy, I emphasize healthy, skepticism about the generals, and above all, about the munitions makers who comprise the military-industrial complex.
Richard, we've talked about several presidents who had, near-death experiences as a part of their wartime service. So H.W. Bush, Gerald Ford, President Johnson, who took a different plane, John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Could you talk about, again, you mentioned this earlier, the sense of personal destiny or a sense of need to make something, having been spared and having to achieve something. Was that a motivating factor for some of these men? Did they write that in their own words? Did they talk about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to answer because it's hard to draw a line, for example, between Lyndon Johnson emerging almost on his knees in prayerful gratitude to this inexplicable twist of fate that preserved him, and 25 years later, spending half of his nights in the Situation Room targeting bombing raids over North Vietnam. I don't know. You'd like to think that military service would emphasize service first, and those who see military service firsthand, who see the horrors of war, who see the randomness of death, would be branded for life with, first of all, a kind of personal humility and a recognition that in war the best laid plans are very rarely implemented as their planners would have them. So a kind of personal humility, if you will, and dare I say, an institutional modesty, not about the objectives, um, not about the sacrifice that the country is willing to make, but about the imperfectibility of human planning.
I have one more question for our conversation this evening. Richard, when George H.W. Bush passed away, there was an editorial written in Time magazine, and it said, the title was, George H.W. Bush was the last president to serve in combat. America could use more leaders like him. Again, going back to that point where he was the last one to serve in combat, but we've had the opportunity to elect folks who have served in Vietnam, for example, John Kerry, John McCain, who was a prisoner of war. You know, we haven't chosen to do that, I guess. What do you think that says about, does it say anything about our values and who we choose to represent us, and do you think we are likely to elect or pick as a contender someone with active military service?
Well, I would say this. I'm not sure how to answer the question, except to say that if the price of having sort of experienced people with a sixth sense for, the vagaries of war is to graduate a class of presidents who fight in a war, whether it's a traditional hot war or it's a cold war. I'm not sure that's a price that we should be willing to pay. The fact is, some of our arguably our great war presidents, Lincoln was the greatest war president of all. His military career consisted of about 85 days in the rather comical Black Hawk War in rural Illinois. Woodrow Wilson was ironically, the measure of the disillusionment that I referred to earlier that followed World War One. It was the flip side of of Wilson's success in rhetorically rousing this nation that traditionally had, first of all, had never sent an expeditionary force, let alone 2 million men overseas. And it could be argued the United States had no um, obvious economic or even political dog in the fight. I mean, we might be sympathetic to the Allies against the Kaiser's Germany, but it wasn't as if the fact of the matter is, in those days, the Atlantic and the Pacific were like moats around the castle. I mean, we were isolated in every sense of the word, and yet Wilson found it in himself, and in some ways, he paid a high price later on when he was unable to deliver on those promises at Versailles, and he continues to pay a high price among historians who take him to task for his alleged inadequacies.
Richard, thanks so much for being with us this evening, and thank you for contributing to our presidential lecture series so heavily as you had this year. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Audrey, so much. Thank you to your viewers and to your staff who make these programs possible. It's always an honor and a privilege to be asked to be part of one.
Well, we look forward to, if we don't talk to you before this time, it'll be about a year from now when we hope to get you back to talk about your biography of President Gerald Ford. Working title you mentioned was An Ordinary Man. Is that correct?
Yeah, in an ironic sense, absolutely. Yeah,
All
I will look forward to that. Not least of all because it means after 8 years, I will have finally finished the project.
Well, we'll really look forward to that over these coming months, Richard. We'll see you again soon. Thanks again.
You bet. Thank you, Audrey.
Sure. And thank you all to our viewing audience, our virtual audience this evening. Thanks for joining us for this final installment of our presidential lecture series of this season. We hope you will join us again, either virtually or at the Dole Institute very soon. You have an opportunity to do that next Thursday, March 31st at 7 p.m. here at the Dole Institute is our annual Student Advisory Board program run by our students here, like Tyler, and Catherine Magana is our Student Advisory Board coordinator. She will be moderating the discussion. You won't want to miss it. It's the fall election forecast, midterm elections for 2022. She'll be interviewing Colleen McCain-Nelson, who is the executive editor of the Sacramento Bee and a former Dole Fellow, along with Jerry Seib, who is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and also KU graduate. They're going to be talking about what we might expect in the 2022 midterms. You can come here to the Dole Institute to see that interview at 7 o'clock, or you can watch it online at doleinstitute.org. I'm Audrey Coleman, the director of the Dole Institute of Politics. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again really soon.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics tonight. If you're a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all our upcoming events. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.